A soldier returned home after 6 long years lost between the battlefield and a hospital bed. But nothing prepared him for what he found. Following his loyal German shepherd, Ranger, into the sweltering Texas summer night, he stumbled upon an old wooden shed behind his ex-wife's house and froze. Inside, his 7-year-old daughter was curled up on the dusty floor, clutching a torn teddy bear as if it were her last lifeline. His ex-wife swore the child wasn't even there. Her new husband was as ruthless as a predator, and the entire neighborhood had stayed silent, as if they were accomplices. But one action from the father, and the entire web of lies came crashing down. As you listen, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from today? Now, let's begin. The Texas summer night was thick and humid, the warm air clinging heavily under a quiet, starless sky. Inside the Military Rehabilitation Center on the edge of Dallas, fluorescent lights buzzed softly, cutting through the silence. Outside, cicadas whined in the distance, their song weaving into the scent of sun-baked asphalt that drifted in through a half-open window. Ethan Walker, 35 years old, sat on the edge of his narrow bed, his forearms resting on his knees, fingers laced together so tightly his knuckles blanched white. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his lean muscles hardened by years of military service, though his posture sagged with weariness. His dark brown hair, cropped short, clung damp to his forehead, and uneven stubble shadowed his jaw. A scar carved across his left temple into his hairline, the brutal reminder of the roadside explosion in Afghanistan 6 years ago. 6 years. 6 years gone from his own life. Ethan's gray-blue eyes stared at the wall, but his mind was elsewhere. Most nights he drowned in fragments, the crack of gunfire, the roar of collapsing walls, muffled shouting, sterile hospital ceilings. The nightmares dragged him back into panic until Ranger, his service dog, nudged him awake. Ranger, a 5-year-old German shepherd with sleek black and tan fur and sharp amber eyes, lay at Ethan's feet. The dog was trained to catch the tremors before they swallowed him whole, grounding him with a steady presence. More than a therapy dog, Ranger had become the only constant in Ethan's fractured existence. But earlier that day, something had pierced through the fog. During therapy, Ethan's mind had opened to a memory, not of war, but of home. He saw tiny hands reaching for him, heard the faint giggle of a baby girl, felt the warmth of soft curls brushing his cheek. A voice echoed faintly in his mind, a word that shattered him more than any explosion ever could. Daddy? Sophie, his daughter. She would be 7 now, but the last memory he had of her was from when she was only 1 year old. A little girl with round cheeks, toothless laughter, and eyes full of wonder. She had clutched at his uniform collar, babbling happily, too young to understand that he was leaving again. That was all he had left, a single snapshot in time. And now, he didn't know who she had become. Did she still laugh that way? Did she remember him at all? Or had she grown up believing her father was a ghost? With the memory came the image of Lena Walker, his wife back then. Tall, graceful, with auburn hair that fell around her shoulders and hazel eyes that once held both love and defiance. She had been his anchor in the storm, carrying more weight than anyone should have while he was gone. But when the explosion tore him from the world, when the military declared him missing in action, presumed dead, Lena had been left to grieve, and eventually to move on. Ethan pressed his palms together, pressing until the tendons ached. He didn't blame her. How could he? but the thought of Sophie growing up in another man's house, perhaps calling that man Dad, burned deep in his chest. He reached down, brushing his hand along Ranger's neck. "We're going home," he whispered hoarsely. Ranger lifted his head, eyes locking onto Ethan's as if understanding. The decision was made. 2 days later, Ethan packed his duffel, a handful of clothes, medical papers, and an old photo from before his deployment. Lena smiling, holding baby Sophie in her arms. The picture had been his lifeline during therapy, proof that a part of him had once belonged to something more than war. He loaded the bag into the trunk of a dusty sedan, and Ranger leapt into the passenger seat. With one last look at the barren Texas horizon, Ethan turned the key and began the long drive east. Highways stretched endlessly, asphalt shimmering under the punishing sun. The air smelled of dry dust and gasoline, the heat radiating in waves through the windshield. Ethan's grip on the steering wheel was iron tight, his shoulders locked with tension, as though the whole journey might splinter if he let himself relax. Silence filled the car, broken only by the steady hum of tires and Ranger's breathing. Every mile carried him closer to the past he both longed for and feared. By the second evening, the land changed. Rolling North Carolina hills replaced endless Texas plains, and heavy humidity clung to the air. Towering oaks lined the narrower roads, their branches stretching overhead like watchful sentinels. As the sun sank low, spilling gold across the horizon, a sign appeared: Ashwood. Home. Ethan slowed as he entered the small town, the scent of honeysuckle drifting through the open window. The cracked brick sidewalks, the tidy houses beneath broad trees, the flicker of old lampposts, it all looked familiar, yet impossibly distant, as though it belonged to someone else's life. He turned onto a quiet street, his breath catching when he saw it. The house. The siding had been repainted a soft blue. Fresh flower beds edged the walkway. A porch swing swayed gently in the warm summer air. It was his house. And yet, it wasn't his anymore. Ranger sat up straight, ears pricked, sensing his master's turmoil. Ethan's throat tightened. He had come back carrying hope, clinging to the memory of a little girl he hadn't seen since she was 1 year old. He wanted to believe he could reclaim that life, but staring at the house he realized the truth pressing against his chest. Everything had changed. Ethan sat in his car for a long moment, his hands tightening around the steering wheel, trying to steady his breath. The 2-story house in front of him, once his home, looked the same and yet foreign, with its pale blue siding, freshly painted shutters, and flower beds blooming under the summer sun. 1,000 memories tangled inside him, but they slipped like sand through his fingers. Ranger, sitting upright in the passenger seat, shifted slightly, his black and tan fur catching the soft golden light. The German shepherd's amber eyes were locked on the front porch, his ears pricked, his body tense. Ethan reached down, brushing his fingers over Ranger's neck. "It's okay, boy," he whispered, though the unease coiled in his chest told him it wasn't. Before he could think, the front door opened. A woman stepped out, pausing on the porch. Lena Walker, or at least that's who she had been. She looked almost the same as the last time he remembered her, yet time had etched faint shadows beneath her hazel eyes. Her auburn hair, tied loosely behind her neck, glimmered in the fading light. She wore a soft ivory blouse and pale linen pants, and despite the heat, her skin looked pale, fragile. Standing at 5'7", Lena's posture was stiff, and her lips parted slightly as if she had forgotten how to breathe. Her hazel eyes widened the moment they locked onto Ethan. Her fingers clutched the doorframe, knuckles paling, and for several seconds no words passed between them. The weight of 6 lost years hung in the humid air between them. Finally, she breathed his name, soft but breaking. Ethan. He swallowed hard, forcing his voice to remain steady, though his throat felt dry. Lena. Her mouth trembled, but before she could say more, footsteps echoed from inside. A tall figure stepped out behind her, moving with slow, deliberate precision. Dale Harper, Lena's husband now, filled the doorway. He was around 40, tall and broad-shouldered, with a solid frame built from years of manual work rather than gym training. His dark hair was neatly trimmed, revealing a high, sharp hairline, and his clean-shaven jawline was square and rigid. Dale's skin was tanned from long days outdoors, but his deep-set brown eyes were flat, cold, and unwelcoming. He placed a hand lightly on Lena's shoulder as if claiming the space beside her. "Didn't realize ghosts knock on doors," he said, his voice low but carrying a cutting edge. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he ignored the remark. His gray-blue eyes focused on Lena, who seemed frozen between relief, guilt, and shock. Finally, he spoke, his voice controlled but quiet. "I came to see Sophie." Lena blinked rapidly, her lips parting and closing before sound returned. For a heartbeat, something like panic flashed in her expression. Her gaze darted briefly toward Dale, then back to Ethan. She's away right now," she said, her tone uneven at first but steadier the second time. "A summer camp. It's organized by her school." Ethan's breath stilled in his chest. "Summer camp?" His voice was soft, but beneath the question was a sharp undertone. He glanced past Lena, catching glimpses of the hallway inside. A vase of fresh lilies on the console table, framed photos on the walls, but none of them close enough for him to see Sophie's face. Ranger shifted at his side, muscles taut, a faint growl rising from his throat. Ethan placed a calming hand over the dog's head, fingers curling gently through his fur. He could feel Ranger's unease vibrating beneath his palm. Dale's eyes flicked down to the German Shepherd with thinly veiled irritation before stepping forward slightly, folding his arms across his chest. "It's a long program," Dale said, his tone deliberate, controlled. "Several weeks. You came a little too late, Walker." Ethan's gaze moved from Dale back to Lena. Her hands twisted together in front of her, her shoulders slightly hunched inward, avoiding his direct stare. Something wasn't right. He had seen that same subtle fear in people before. Soldiers withholding truths, civilians hiding things out of shame or survival. It was in the stiffness of her jaw, the way her gaze lingered on the ground rather than meeting his eyes. Ethan took a slow breath, forcing calm into his voice. "Can I call her? Or maybe you could tell me where she's staying. I'd just want to hear her voice." Lena hesitated. It was barely noticeable, just the smallest flicker, but Ethan caught it instantly. She glanced at Dale again, almost involuntarily, and the silence between them deepened. Finally, Lena's voice came out soft, restrained. "The camp doesn't allow phone calls." Ranger let out a single low bark, sharp and unexpected, breaking the tension like shattered glass. Ethan gave the leash a subtle tug, quieting him, but his own heartbeat thudded harder now. For several seconds, no one spoke. Cicadas buzzed faintly in the distance. A warm breeze carried the scent of honeysuckle, but the sweetness hung heavy, suffocating against the tension at the doorstep. Finally, Dale stepped forward, his stance firm, broad shoulders squaring subtly. "Look, Walker," he said, using Ethan's last name with deliberate weight. "Lena's moved on. We've built a life here. Sophie's fine. Best thing you can do is let her stay fine." The muscles in Ethan's jaw flexed. He kept his voice steady, refusing to give Dale the satisfaction of reaction. "You're saying she's fine. I'd like to hear that from her." Dale's lips pressed into a thin line, his posture unyielding. His deep-set eyes held Ethan's gaze like steel locking against steel. For a long moment, neither man moved, the silent clash between them louder than any raised voice could have been. Lena stepped forward slightly, placing a hand on Dale's forearm as though trying to soften his stance. "Ethan, this isn't the time," she said quietly, her voice carrying a tremor she couldn't quite hide. Ethan stared at her, searching her expression for answers he couldn't find in words. Finally, he nodded once, curt and measured. "I'll come back," he said simply. Turning away, he tugged lightly on Ranger's leash, and the German shepherd fell into step beside him, ears still angled backward toward the house, as though unwilling to turn his back on it completely. As Ethan walked back to the car, the unease inside him deepened rather than eased. Ranger trotted silently at his side, occasionally glancing up at him as if to confirm what they both sensed but couldn't yet name. Ethan climbed into the driver's seat, resting both hands on the wheel without starting the engine. He could feel the sweat at the back of his neck, sticky beneath the weight of July's heat, but his chest felt cold, heavy with unanswered questions. He replayed every flicker in Lena's eyes, every controlled breath in Dale's voice, every hesitation too sharp to ignore. Something was wrong. But, with his memory still fractured, with 6 years lost to him, Ethan didn't yet know how the pieces fit together. All he knew, with absolute certainty, was that Sophie wasn't where they said she was. He turned the key, the low rumble of the engine breaking the silence, and drove slowly away from the house, Ranger's watchful gaze fixed on the rearview mirror until the pale blue siding disappeared from sight. Deep inside, the soldier in him stirred. Something had changed while he was gone, and whatever it was, he intended to find out. The July air in Ashwood hung heavy and damp, clinging to Ethan's skin as he walked along the quiet back streets of the neighborhood. The old oak trees swayed gently under the sticky evening breeze, their long shadows stretching across cracked sidewalks. Ranger padded silently at his side, his sleek black and tan coat glistening faintly under the fading light, his amber eyes alert, scanning every corner as though sensing something Ethan couldn't yet see. 3 days had passed since Ethan had stood on the porch of his old home and walked away with more questions than answers. Sleep had become a stranger since then. Every time he closed his eyes, Sophie's face, the 1-year-old he remembered from so long ago, blurred into something unknown, untouchable. Lena's excuses echoed endlessly in his mind. Summer camp, no phone calls, long-term program, but each word tasted wrong, unnatural. Ranger sensed his unease too. The German shepherd's tension never faded, his body stiff whenever they passed by the house. Ethan had started walking the area at night, using the excuse of clearing his mind, but deep down he knew what he was doing, watching. He didn't want to admit it, but something inside him whispered that Sophie wasn't where Lena claimed she was. Tonight, Ranger stopped suddenly. The dog's ears pricked forward, tail rigid, his muscles coiled beneath his dark coat. Ethan crouched slightly, following the line of Ranger's gaze. They were at the edge of the property, where the backyard sloped down behind the house into overgrown grass and scattered shadows. "Easy, boy," Ethan whispered, but Ranger ignored him. Instead, the German Shepherd padded carefully toward the back fence, nose low, every step measured. Ethan followed quietly, the damp grass soaking the edges of his boots as his breath came slower, heavier. Then he heard it. At first, it was faint, a muffled, broken sound carried through the humid night air like a ghost's whisper. Ethan froze, tilting his head. Ranger gave a low, anxious whine, ears swiveling toward the sound. And then, clearer this time, soft, uneven sobs. Ethan's chest tightened. He followed Ranger down a narrow path lined with weeds until they reached the far corner of the yard. There, half hidden behind tangled vines, stood an old wooden animal shed, its planks warped and weathered, paint peeling in faded strips. The roof sagged slightly, and the small door hung crooked on rusted hinges. Memories flickered, faint and fragmented. This had once been the place Lena used to keep tools in small crates years ago, back when the house still belonged to them. The crying came from inside. Ethan crouched down slowly, his calloused fingers brushing against the damp wood of the doorframe. Ranger pressed close to his leg, his deep amber eyes fixed on the darkness beyond, a low rumble vibrating softly in his throat. With one hand, Ethan carefully pushed the warped door open. It creaked loudly, the sound scraping across the still night, and for a moment the crying stopped entirely. Inside, the air was damp and heavy, carrying the stench of old straw, dust, and something faintly sour, neglect. His gray-blue eyes adjusted slowly to the gloom until they landed on a small figure huddled in the corner. Sophie. Her knees were drawn tight to her chest, thin arms wrapped around a tattered brown teddy bear whose fur was worn nearly smooth in patches. Her blonde hair, tangled and dull, clung to her tear-streaked cheeks. The pink shirt she wore was smeared with dirt, and the gray leggings on her legs were ripped at the knees. Her bare feet were dusty, her small toes curling into the straw-covered floor. Ethan froze, his entire body locking into stillness as the world seemed to tilt beneath him. He'd prepared himself for anything, or so he thought, but this he couldn't have imagined. "Sophie," his voice cracked, barely a whisper. The little girl startled at the sound, her wide hazel eyes lifting toward him, shining in the dim light, though dulled by exhaustion. Her lower lip trembled as she clutched the teddy bear tighter to her chest, pressing herself back against the wall as if trying to disappear into it. I'm sorry," Sophie whispered hoarsely, her voice raspy from crying. "I didn't eat anything. I didn't take food. Please, don't punish me." The words hit Ethan like a blow, his breath catching hard in his throat. His hands shook as he took a careful step forward, lowering himself to one knee to make himself smaller, less frightening. No, sweetheart, no one's going to punish you. It's me. It's Daddy." Her hazel eyes darted to him, confusion flickering through them as though she wanted to believe but didn't dare. Ranger stepped forward quietly, his soft paws pressing against the dirt floor. The German Shepherd let out a gentle whine, lowering his head, his amber gaze fixed on Sophie, as though he understood her fear. Ethan extended a trembling hand, palm up, waiting. Sophie hesitated, her tiny shoulders shaking. Her breathing came shallow and uneven. Then, with tentative slowness, she stretched her small hand toward his fingertips, only to flinch violently the moment his skin brushed hers. She pulled back, curling tighter around her teddy bear, her tiny body pressing hard against the corner. Ethan's throat burned as realization clawed through him. She wasn't just scared. She was conditioned to fear touch. Someone had taught her to brace for pain. Rage flared hot beneath his ribs, but he forced his voice to stay gentle, steady. "Sophie, it's okay. No one's gonna hurt you now. I promise." Ranger lowered himself onto his belly, inching closer on his forepaws, his ears relaxed, tail sweeping faintly against the floor. The dog gave a soft chuff, his presence calm and reassuring, and Sophie's hazel eyes flickered toward him with hesitant recognition. She loosened her grip on the teddy bear just enough to reach out, brushing her tiny fingers against Ranger's fur. Ethan held his breath as he watched the moment unfold, the fragile connection between child and dog, trust bridging where words had failed. He took the opportunity to inch closer, lowering himself until he sat cross-legged on the straw-covered floor. "I came back for you," he whispered, his voice breaking around the edges. "Daddy's here now. You're safe." Sophie blinked at him, her little face streaked with dirt and tears, and for the first time she let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a breath of relief. But when Ethan gently reached to lift her into his arms, she recoiled instinctively, curling into herself, shoulders hunched, knees tucked, arms covering her head, a defensive posture he recognized from soldiers on the battlefield. His chest constricted painfully. How many times had she been punished like this? How long had she been locked away, alone, terrified, believing she had to apologize just for existing? He withdrew his hands immediately, forcing his body to stay still, swallowing the lump in his throat. "It's okay," he murmured softly, his voice rough but quiet. "We'll go at your pace. No one's gonna hurt you again. Ever." A few minutes passed like that, silent except for Sophie's trembling breaths and the steady sound of Ranger's soft panting beside them. Then Ethan leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice to the gentlest whisper. "Sophie, did Mommy tell you you'd be going to camp?" Her lips parted, but no words came, just a small shake of her head, slow and deliberate. Her hazel eyes met his, clouded with confusion, shame, and exhaustion all at once. It was enough. Ethan felt his chest tighten, the fragments snapping into place with a brutal clarity. Lena had lied. Sophie hadn't gone to any summer camp. She'd been here all along, locked away, starved, neglected. Ranger pressed closer to Ethan's leg, sensing his racing pulse, his ears flicking as if anticipating what came next. Ethan reached down, running his palm slowly over the shepherd's warm fur, grounding himself. He stared at his daughter, so small, so fragile, clutching the remnants of comfort in the form of a torn teddy bear, and in that moment, he made himself a silent promise. He would never leave her again. The late evening heat clung stubbornly to Ethan's skin as he stood on the front porch of his former home, fists clenched at his sides. The pale blue siding gleamed faintly under the soft glow of the porch light, but inside his chest a storm raged. Ranger stood beside him, ears pricked, the black and tan German shepherd's tail rigid, his amber eyes locked on the door. He could sense Ethan's tension, mirroring it with a low rumble deep in his throat. The door opened after a long pause, revealing Lena Walker. She looked tired, fragile even, her auburn hair tied back loosely, strands sticking to her damp cheeks in the sticky Carolina humidity. Her hazel eyes were rimmed with redness, and she clutched the doorframe like someone bracing against a storm. For a moment, Silence stretched between them, but Ethan's jaw flexed before he finally spoke, voice rough and steady. "We need to talk. About Sophie." Lena's lips parted, but her words faltered before they could form. A tremor passed over her face, a mixture of guilt and exhaustion, and she shook her head faintly. "Ethan, please, not here." Behind her, footsteps thudded against the hardwood floor, heavy and deliberate. Dale Harper stepped into view, his tall, broad frame filling the hallway. He wore a faded gray t-shirt and jeans, arms crossed tightly across his chest, his clean-shaven jaw sharp beneath the porch light. Dale's deep-set brown eyes glinted with irritation as he leaned casually against the doorway, though there was nothing relaxed about the stiffness in his shoulders. "What is it now?" Dale asked coldly, his voice a low rumble laced with disdain. Ethan's gaze never left Lena. "I found her," he said, his tone sharp. "I found Sophie in the shed, Dale. Locked up. Starving." Lena's hazel eyes went wide as tears spilled over her lashes. She covered her mouth with one trembling hand and let out a choked sob. I tried to stop him," she whispered, her voice cracking. "But he wouldn't listen to me. He said Sophie was a burden." Dale's expression darkened instantly. He straightened his stance, towering slightly as his voice rose. "Watch what you're implying, Lena." His eyes burned as he turned them on Ethan. "You don't belong here, Walker. You left 6 years ago. You don't get to come back and dictate how things are run in this house." Ethan stepped forward, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across the porch, his gray-blue eyes sharp and unyielding. "This isn't about you. It's about my daughter." Dale's jaw flexed, and in a sudden burst of anger he shoved Ethan hard in the chest. Ethan stumbled back a step but didn't fall, catching himself as Ranger lunged forward, teeth bared, a fierce bark tearing through the humid air. Ethan held the leash tight, his other hand raised instinctively to calm the dog, but his glare never left Dale's face. "You think you can threaten me?" Dale snapped, his voice louder now, drawing faint echoes from the neighboring houses. "You try interfering again, Walker, and I swear I'll have Sophie sent to an orphanage. You'll never see her again." The words landed like a blow, but Ethan didn't flinch. Instead, he drew a long, steady breath, locking eyes with Dale. "Try it," he said softly, his voice low and dangerous, "and I'll bury you in court." Lena sobbed quietly behind Dale, her hands shaking violently as she turned her face away, unable to watch the clash between them. For a tense moment, the three stood frozen until a soft voice called from across the yard. "Ethan?" Ethan turned his head and saw Mrs. Thornton, the elderly neighbor, standing beneath the shadow of a pecan tree, her silver-gray hair tied in a neat bun. At 72, Mrs. Thornton was small and frail-looking, her thin frame hidden beneath a faded floral dress, but her sharp blue eyes carried a weight of knowing. In her right hand, she clutched a small brown envelope. She glanced nervously at Dale and Lena before tilting her head slightly, motioning Ethan toward the edge of her yard. Ethan hesitated only briefly before walking toward her, Ranger following silently at his side. When they reached the cover of the tree, Mrs. Thornton's voice lowered to a whisper, trembling slightly. I've seen too much, Ethan. I couldn't stay quiet anymore." She pressed the envelope into his palm, her thin fingers cold despite the heat. "It's all here. I installed a small camera behind my garden fence last year to catch raccoons digging through my plants." Her gaze shifted briefly toward Lena's backyard, her expression grim. But it captured something else instead. Ethan carefully opened the envelope, sliding out a small black USB drive. Mrs. Thornton's voice cracked as she continued. Footage of him, Dale, hitting Sophie, screaming at her, making her sleep out there in that shed. Her throat tightened with emotion, her old hands trembling as she clasped them together. I should have spoken up sooner, but I was scared. Ethan's jaw locked, his breath coming heavier now, the USB clutched tightly in his fist. You did the right thing, he said firmly, his voice low but steady. I'll handle this. She nodded slowly, her lined face softening with quiet relief, then glanced back toward her house before disappearing silently into the shadows. Ethan stood there for a moment beneath the tree, the night thick around him, Ranger's warm presence pressed against his side. He looked down at the USB drive, the tiny object heavy with the weight of truth, and knew exactly what he needed to do next. Pulling his phone from his pocket, Ethan scrolled to a familiar number. After a moment, a gruff but steady voice answered. Parker Williams. Parker had been Ethan's military attorney during his service, a man in his late 40s with a commanding presence built over years of courtroom battles. Ethan remembered him well. 6 feet tall, stocky but solid, his salt and pepper hair cropped short and always combed neatly, dark green eyes sharp behind thin rectangular glasses. Parker was known for his relentless preparation, sharp wit, and unwavering loyalty to the soldiers he defended, a reputation forged after his younger brother, also a Marine, was wrongfully discharged years ago. Since then, Parker had made it his mission to fight for veterans and their families. Parker, it's Ethan, he said quietly. I need your help. There was a pause on the other end, a subtle intake of breath. Walker, after all these years? What's going on? Ethan exhaled slowly, the words hard but steady. It's Sophie. She's in danger. I have proof. There was no hesitation in Parker's reply. Bring me everything you've got, tonight. Back in his rented room, Ethan set up his old laptop, inserting the USB drive. Ranger settled on the rug nearby, his head resting on his paws but his eyes still watchful, mirroring his master's tension. The footage played in silence, Dale's towering figure leaning over Sophie, his shadow blocking the dim shed light, his arm jerking violently as Sophie shrank into the corner, clutching her teddy bear like a shield. Ethan's stomach twisted as he watched her tiny frame flinch with each blow, his grip tightening so hard on the edge of the desk his knuckles turned white. He turned away before the video ended, leaning against the wall, pressing a hand over his face as he forced air into his lungs. Rage burned deep, but so did something else. Purpose. Ethan dialed Parker again. I'll bring the footage tomorrow. Start building the case. Dale doesn't get to keep hurting her, not one more day. You've got my word, Parker said firmly. That night, as Sophie slept curled up against Ranger's side, clutching her ragged teddy bear, Ethan sat on the floor beside her small mattress, running a hand through her tangled blonde hair. He leaned close and whispered, voice trembling but steady in promise. No one's ever going to hurt you again, baby girl, I swear it. The July evening settled heavy over Ashwood, the thick air humming with the sounds of cicadas while distant music drifted faintly from Ethan's old home. Multicolored lights decorated the backyard where Dale Harper had thrown a lavish birthday party for his 6-year-old son from a previous marriage. Through the gaps between swaying oak leaves, Ethan could see tables draped with bright blue cloths, paper lanterns dangling from strings, and balloons bouncing lazily in the humid breeze. Guests in light summer clothes mingled under the glowing canopy, holding glasses of wine and small plates of food. To any passing neighbor, it was an image of suburban perfection. But Ethan knew better. Hidden beneath the shade of a large pecan tree across the street, he crouched low beside Ranger, his German shepherd, who lay with his ears forward, body tense, ready. The dog's amber eyes glimmered under the moonlight, his fur catching flashes of soft color from the party lights in the distance. Ranger was silent, but Ethan could feel the quiet energy radiating from him. The same silent readiness they'd shared in darker days on foreign soil. Beside him, Parker Williams knelt, adjusting a small portable camera mounted on a telescopic tripod. The device was sleek and discreet, its dark casing blending with the night. Parker's salt and pepper hair glinted faintly in the dim light from a nearby street lamp. Dressed in a simple dark polo shirt and jeans, the 48-year-old attorney moved with the calm precision of someone who had prepared for this moment carefully, deliberately. His rectangular glasses slid slightly down the bridge of his nose as he double-checked the angle of the lens. "You sure about the range?" Ethan asked quietly, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the distant house. Parker gave a small nod, his green eyes sharp behind the lenses. "Absolutely. The fence line's close enough for a clean angle on the shed. Once the party noise dies down, the microphones will pick up almost everything." Ethan inhaled slowly, steadying his thoughts. Just behind the backyard, mostly concealed by the rows of hedges and decorative vines, was the small wooden shed where Sophie had been locked away before. Even from here, Ethan could see the faint outline of the crooked roof under the pale glow of backyard string lights. A deep ache twisted in his chest as memories of her trembling frame and whispered apologies resurfaced. He shifted slightly, his hand brushing over Ranger's head, grounding himself. "She's still in there," he murmured, his voice low, heavy with restrained fury. Parker glanced at him briefly, but didn't speak. He didn't need to. The plan had already been discussed, rehearsed. Act now, and everything could fall apart. They needed undeniable proof. From the backyard came bursts of laughter. Guests, mostly couples from the neighborhood and a few of Dale's colleagues, clustered near the long buffet table under a canopy of fairy lights. Dale moved among them like a proud host, his broad frame straight, a crisp navy shirt tucked neatly into tailored khakis. He smiled too easily, shook hands too firmly, his deep-set brown eyes narrowing slightly whenever anyone asked about Sophie. Lena was there too, though her expression told a different story. Standing near the drinks table, she wore a soft blue dress, and her auburn hair flowed loosely over her shoulders, though faint shadows darkened her hazel eyes. She smiled when spoken to, but her movements were restrained, almost mechanical, as if her body attended the party while her mind was elsewhere entirely. Behind the cheerful display, past the laughter and clinking glasses, Ethan's gaze remained fixed on the shed. A muffled sound carried faintly through the night, so soft at first that he thought he imagined it. Then it came again, a faint, stifled sob. Ethan's breath hitched, his hand instinctively tightening around Ranger's collar as the shepherd's ears twitched sharply toward the sound. Parker leaned close, lowering his voice to a whisper. "Cameras locked. Let it record everything." Inside the shed, a hidden motion-sensitive lens they'd planted earlier that afternoon began transmitting directly to Parker's laptop. Ethan's eyes flicked to the small screen where the grainy image appeared. Sophie, curled up against the wall, her tiny arms wrapped around the tattered teddy bear. Her blonde hair fell messily around her thin face, cheeks streaked with dirt and dried tears. Then the screen jolted. The shed door creaked open, and Dale's figure filled the narrow frame, towering and rigid. His angular jaw was tight, his nostrils flared, and his clean-shaven face looked carved from stone under the dim light spilling from the backyard. In his right hand he gripped a long wooden spoon, the kind used for stirring stews, but the end of it was darkened from years of wear. The audio came through faint, but clear enough. "I told you to stop crying," Dale hissed, his deep voice sharp and clipped, his shadow looming over Sophie. "Do you want me to take that bear away too?" Sophie's soft, broken voice stammered something unintelligible, clutching the teddy closer, and Dale's hand lashed out, the wooden spoon striking her bare calf with a sharp snap. She let out a small whimper and pressed herself against the wall, muffling her cries in the crook of her arms. Ethan's entire body locked up, his jaw tight, muscles coiled with restrained rage. Ranger growled low, a sound deep and guttural, picking up on his master's pulse. "Easy," Parker whispered, putting a steadying hand on Ethan's shoulder. "Not yet. If you go in now, they'll bury this, and Dale walks free. We need the evidence airtight." Ethan forced his lungs to pull in air, fists curling until his nails dug painfully into his palms. He tore his gaze away from the laptop screen, staring at the backyard lights beyond the hedges, every fiber of his being screaming to intervene. The video continued. Dale stood over Sophie a moment longer, muttering under his breath about spoiled brats and burdens, before storming out, slamming the shed door hard enough to rattle the frame. The silence that followed on the recording was unbearable. Ethan turned his head toward Parker, his voice low and ragged. "We're going to bury him with this." Parker nodded, closing the laptop carefully before sliding it into his black messenger bag. "Already working on it. I'll send this to Child Protective Services tonight and loop in Sheriff Hargrove first thing in the morning." Sheriff Hargrove was a seasoned officer in her early 50s, tall and commanding with closely cropped silver blonde hair and sharp gray eyes. Known in Ashwood for her zero-tolerance approach toward abuse cases, she'd been leading the county for nearly 2 decades. Parker had briefed her anonymously the week before. Now, with this footage, she would move fast. Ethan's breath steadied as he ran a hand through Ranger's fur, the familiar texture grounding him, pulling him back from the edge. The sounds of the party swelled again in the distance. Children's laughter, clinking glasses, Dale's booming voice cutting above the crowd as he toasted his son. The contrast between the celebration and the cruelty hidden behind the shed twisted something deep in Ethan's chest. But tonight wasn't about confrontation. Tonight was about preparation. He glanced down at Ranger, scratching lightly behind the shepherd's ears. "Soon, buddy," he murmured softly. "We're gonna get her out. But we do it right." Ranger's ears flicked in response, amber eyes locked steadily on Ethan as though he understood. Together, the three of them, soldier, lawyer, and K9, melted deeper into the shadows, leaving the party to its lights and laughter, carrying with them the kind of evidence that would burn Dale's carefully built world to the ground. The air inside the Ashwood County Courthouse was thick with tension, the faint hum of the ceiling fans doing little to ease the weight pressing down on everyone's shoulders. The tall, arched windows let in muted July sunlight, spilling across polished oak benches filled with spectators, murmurs settling into silence as the bailiff called the court to order. Ethan sat at the plaintiff's table, his gray-blue eyes fixed on the door ahead, his broad shoulders drawn tight beneath a fitted navy jacket. Beside him sat Parker Williams, his attorney, his rectangular glasses perched neatly on his nose as he arranged files with meticulous precision. His salt-and-pepper hair looked sharper under the courtroom lights, his green eyes steady and calculating behind his calm expression. Ranger lay at Ethan's feet, the German shepherd's black and tan fur gleaming under the sunlit floorboards. Though officially allowed as Ethan's PTSD service dog, Ranger seemed to understand the gravity of this day. His amber eyes focused, his posture tense, tail curled tight around his side. Every time Ethan shifted in his seat, Ranger's ears flicked instinctively, mirroring his master's restrained anxiety. The heavy oak doors opened, and Judge Miriam Darnell entered, a woman in her early 60s, tall and lean, with neatly cropped silver hair and sharp brown eyes that missed nothing. Her reputation in Ashwood was one of fierce impartiality. She was respected, feared, and unyielding when it came to justice. Dressed in a simple black robe, she carried herself with quiet authority as she took her seat at the bench. "All rise," the bailiff announced, and the room stood before slowly settling again as Judge Darnell spoke. "This hearing will determine custody of minor Sophie Walker and address allegations of child neglect and abuse. We will hear arguments, review evidence, and call witnesses." At the defense table, Lena Harper, once Lena Walker, sat stiffly, her auburn hair tied in a neat low bun, wearing a muted beige dress that blended into the surroundings. Her hazel eyes darted nervously around the room, avoiding Ethan's gaze. Beside her, Dale Harper leaned back in his chair, his muscular arms crossed tightly across his chest. He wore a pressed charcoal gray shirt, his dark brown eyes cold and unreadable, jaw clenched, projecting defiance even in silence. Ethan forced his breathing into steady rhythm, hands clasped tightly on the table, but his chest still burned with restrained emotion. He had waited for this moment since the day he found Sophie curled up inside that shed, clutching her teddy bear like a lifeline. Judge Darnell gave a small nod to Parker. "Mr. Williams, you may begin." Parker rose smoothly, adjusting his jacket before stepping toward the jury box. "Your Honor, members of the court," he began, his voice calm but resonant, carrying the practiced weight of experience. "This is not just a custody hearing. This is about a 7-year-old child, a little girl who was failed by the very people who were supposed to protect her." He reached for the remote resting on the evidence table and clicked a button. A large screen on the side wall flickered to life, displaying grainy video footage. The courtroom fell silent as the recording from Mrs. Thornton's camera began to play. Dale standing over Sophie, shouting, his hand gripping the long wooden spoon before striking her legs. Sophie's small frame shrank back into the shadows, clutching her teddy bear as she whimpered softly. Gasps rippled through the audience. Someone in the back whispered harshly, "My God!" Parker let the video play only a few seconds more before pausing it on Sophie's terrified face, frozen in time. He turned back to the bench, his voice steady but edged with quiet steel. "This, Your Honor, is not discipline. This is abuse." Lena sat rigid, her face pale, hands knotted tightly in her lap. Then, as Parker faced her directly, her composure cracked. "I didn't know," she cried suddenly, her voice breaking. "I didn't know he was hurting her. I thought he was keeping her safe." Parker's expression didn't soften. "Mrs. Harper, Are you saying you never noticed your daughter was locked in an outdoor shed for days at a time? That she came to school hungry, wearing the same torn clothes? Lena's hazel eyes filled with tears as she buried her face in trembling hands. Dale, meanwhile, leaned forward sharply, his voice cutting low through clenched teeth. Don't twist this, Parker. Sophie was defiant. She needed discipline. Judge Darnell's voice sliced through the growing tension like a blade. Mr. Harper, you will not speak unless addressed. Parker turned back to the screen, clicking to the next exhibit, a photograph of Sophie's teddy bear, the same one Ethan had seen in her hands. Alongside the video, Your Honor, we have a letter written by Sophie herself, recovered during therapy sessions under supervision. He lifted a sealed plastic sleeve containing a folded, crumpled note, his voice softening slightly as he began to read. Dear Mommy, I promise I'll be good. Please don't leave me outside again. I get cold at night, and I'm scared of the dark. I don't cry loud, I promise. I just want Daddy. He looks at me like I'm real. A wave of silence swept across the courtroom. Even Judge Darnell's firm expression faltered momentarily as she exchanged a brief, heavy glance with the jury foreperson. Parker cleared his throat and gestured to the witness stand. Your Honor, I'd like to call Mrs. Evelyn Thornton. The elderly neighbor stepped forward slowly, her frail frame wrapped in a floral dress, her silver-gray hair tied in its usual neat bun. Though her hands trembled slightly, her sharp blue eyes remained steady as she was sworn in and seated. Mrs. Thornton, Parker began gently, can you tell the court what you witnessed over the last few months? Her voice wavered at first, but strengthened with each word. I lived next door. I saw that little girl, night after night, crying softly. I didn't want to interfere at first, but when I noticed Dale carrying food outside and coming back without it, I knew something was wrong. I installed a camera in my garden and... She glanced briefly toward Sophie, her voice breaking. I wish I'd spoken sooner. Parker nodded, his voice low. You helped make sure her voice is finally heard. Thank you. Next, the teacher was called, Miss Karen Brooks, Sophie's second-grade teacher. A woman in her mid-30s with dark curly hair and kind brown eyes. She stood at 5'5", wearing a simple gray cardigan and navy skirt. She carried herself with quiet confidence, though her hands tightened slightly around a folder she held. Miss Brooks, Parker asked, what did you observe about Sophie at school? She came to class hungry most days, Karen answered softly, her voice warm but tinged with guilt. She wore the same worn clothes, some days without shoes. She'd fall asleep on her desk, clutching that teddy bear, and when I asked if she was okay, she'd smile and say she was fine. I filed reports with the school board, but nothing was ever followed up. The courtroom stilled again as Parker returned to his table. He glanced at Ethan, who met his eyes briefly before looking down at Ranger, his hand brushing over the shepherd's soft fur for strength. Finally, Parker turned back to the judge. Your Honor, I believe the person who deserves to speak most is Sophie. Ethan's chest tightened as the bailiff gently guided Sophie forward. Dressed in a pale yellow dress, her blonde hair brushed softly around her thin face, she walked with slow, careful steps, clutching her tattered teddy bear tightly against her chest. Her hazel eyes darted nervously across the large room before settling briefly on Ethan, drawing courage from his steady presence. Judge Darnell leaned forward slightly, her tone softening. Sophie, sweetie, you're safe here. You can tell us anything you want. Sophie hesitated, then stepped onto the witness stand. Her voice trembled at first, so soft that the microphone barely caught it. I want to stay with Daddy," she whispered, holding her bear tighter. "Why, sweetheart?" Judge Darnell asked gently. Sophie blinked, tears forming, her small voice cracking as she replied, "Because Daddy, he looks at me like I'm a person, not like garbage." A hush fell over the room. No one moved. No one breathed. Even Dale's defiant posture faltered, his jaw tightening as his knuckles whitened on the table edge. Judge Darnell closed her eyes briefly, exhaling before sitting straighter. Her gavel struck softly once, grounding the room back into focus. This court hereby grants full custody of Sophie Walker to her father, Ethan Walker. Furthermore, Lena Harper's custodial rights are suspended indefinitely. Dale Harper is to be investigated by county authorities for charges of child endangerment and abuse. The ruling fell like thunder, echoing against the oak-paneled walls. Ethan leaned forward, lowering his head into his hands as relief and grief collided inside him all at once. Ranger nudged his knee gently, sensing the release in his master's body. Sophie climbed off the stand slowly and ran into Ethan's arms, burying her face into his chest as he held her close, whispering softly into her tangled blonde hair. "It's over now, baby girl. You're safe." The soft August sun washed gently over the rolling hills of Ashwood's outskirts, its golden light spilling across fields dotted with wildflowers and oak trees swaying in the mild breeze. In the distance, a small white house with a sloping gray roof stood quietly beneath the shade of tall pecan trees, surrounded by a low wooden fence. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. Ethan had chosen it for its quiet streets, open yard, and distance from painful memories. Inside, the faint smell of freshly cut wood lingered in the living room, where cardboard boxes were still stacked neatly along the walls. Ethan sat on the edge of the new couch, his broad shoulders relaxed for the first time in weeks, though his gray-blue eyes still carried the shadows of the courtroom. Ranger, his loyal German shepherd, lay sprawled at his feet, his sleek black and tan coat catching faint streaks of sunlight. The 5-year-old K9 seemed calmer here, ears slightly relaxed, his amber gaze watching Sophie closely from his place on the rug. Sophie sat cross-legged near the window, her tattered teddy bear resting in her lap as she quietly traced her finger along the wood grain of the floorboards. At 7, she was small for her age, her blonde hair soft and falling loosely to her shoulders, framing her pale cheeks. Though the worst was behind them, remnants of fear still clung to her. Some nights she'd wake screaming, tangled in blankets, her hazel eyes wide with panic until Ranger pressed his warm body against hers and calmed her trembling. Ethan's gaze softened as he watched her, then turned back to unpacking one of the smaller boxes. Inside were fragments of a life he had once abandoned, framed photographs, Sophie's old blanket from before the war, and a set of Lego blocks he'd bought years ago but never had the chance to give her. He swallowed hard, steadying his breath, determined to make up for lost time. By mid-morning, Ethan called softly, "Sophie, come here." She hesitated but slowly padded across the floor, climbing onto the couch beside him. He lifted a small notebook and pen, placing them gently in her hands. "This is yours," he said quietly. "You can write anything you want in here. Things you like, things you feel, even things you're afraid of. You don't have to show anyone unless you want to." Sophie blinked, glancing between the notebook and his face, her lips parting slightly as if to respond, but no words came. Instead, she leaned into his arm, pressing her small body close without saying anything. Ethan wrapped his arm around her shoulders, his hand resting lightly on her back. In the following days, life slowly began to take shape. Ethan officially requested an extended leave from his consulting work, needing time away from deadlines and conference calls. His focus was on Sophie, rebuilding her sense of safety, helping her trust again. They started a small morning routine, breakfast together at the sunlit kitchen table, where Sophie preferred her toast cut into uneven triangles, and Ranger always sat nearby, tail sweeping softly against the floor. Some days they would spend quiet afternoons at the nearby park, where Sophie watched dragonflies skim over the surface of a small pond. Still, the nightmares came. One night, Ethan woke to muffled sobs and the sound of Ranger pacing restlessly in Sophie's room. He found her sitting upright in bed, knees hugged to her chest, whispering apologies into her teddy bear as tears streaked her face. Ethan knelt beside her, brushing soft strands of tangled blonde hair from her damp cheeks. "You're safe now," he murmured, voice steady but low. "No one's going to leave you outside again." Sophie sniffled and buried her face against Ranger's neck, clutching his fur as if holding on to the last thread of certainty she knew. The shepherd pressed closer, letting out a faint whine, his head tilted protectively against her small shoulder. That moment cemented Ethan's resolve. Every scar she carried, every shadow Dale left behind, would fade here, in this home, with time, patience, and love. 2 weeks later, an unexpected letter arrived. The envelope was cream-colored, her name written in neat cursive, Lena Harper. Ethan stared at it for a long moment before opening it in the kitchen under the soft afternoon light. Inside, Lena's handwriting was careful but uneven, as though her hand trembled with each word. "Ethan, I don't expect forgiveness. I failed Sophie. I failed us. I'm getting help now at the Ashwood Recovery Center. I'm trying to get sober, to be better than the woman I was. I want to see her someday, but only if she wants it. Tell her I'm sorry." Ethan folded the letter carefully, setting it aside on the counter. He stared at it for a long time, conflicted, anger and compassion twisting together, neither fully winning. That night, after tucking Sophie into bed, he sat down at his small writing desk and began drafting a letter to her future self. "Sweetheart, one day you might want to meet your mom. When that time comes, I want you to know I'll support whatever you decide. Forgiving someone doesn't mean forgetting what they did. It means giving yourself permission to heal. When you're ready, I'll be here." He placed the letter in a sealed envelope and tucked it into a small box, along with Lena's note and Sophie's drawings from her notebook, a collection of pieces that told the story of survival, pain, and the promise of new beginnings. On a warm Saturday morning, Ethan led Sophie outside into the backyard. The grass was soft beneath their bare feet, the earth smelling rich and alive after a light summer rain. Ranger trotted happily around them, occasionally pouncing at shadows of butterflies while keeping a protective distance from Sophie. Ethan knelt beside a small sapling they had picked out together, a young magnolia tree with glossy green leaves and delicate white buds beginning to bloom. He handed Sophie a small silver trowel, guiding her hands as she dug carefully into the soil. "Every tree starts small," Ethan said gently, brushing the loose dirt from her cheek with his thumb. "Just like us. We plant it, we take care of it, and someday it'll be strong enough to give shade to others." Sophie nodded, her hazel eyes soft and reflective, and together they lowered the sapling into the ground, patting the earth around its fragile roots. Ranger lay nearby, his head resting lazily on his paws, the morning sun turning the tips of his fur golden. When the last bit of soil was settled, Sophie sat back on her heels, watching the tree sway slightly in the breeze. Then, for the first time since Ethan had brought her home, her lips curved into a soft, unguarded smile. A small laugh escaped her, quiet but bright, carrying across the yard like sunlight breaking through clouds. Ethan froze for a heartbeat, soaking in the sound, a sound he thought he'd lost forever, before pulling her into his arms, holding her close as Ranger pressed against them both. For the first time in years, the future felt real, and hope, fragile but undeniable, settled into the little house on the edge of Ashwood. Sometimes God works in the quietest ways. Ethan thought he had lost everything, his memories, his family, his purpose. But God had a plan. Through pain, heartbreak, and second chances, he brought a broken father and his little girl back together. Sophie's smile at the end wasn't just a moment. It was a miracle, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, God plants tiny seeds of hope, waiting for the right time to bloom. And maybe that's the message for all of us today. No matter where you are in your journey, no matter the scars you carry, you are never too far from God's grace. He can turn pain into healing, fear into strength, and silence into laughter again, if you keep believing. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue spreading more stories of faith, hope, and unconditional love. And before you go, may God bless you and your family, keep you safe, and remind you that miracles are real. Sometimes you just have to open your heart to see them.